pushcart on Orchard Street sold Knishes for a nickel, and a block away the pickle barrels stood on the sidewalk in a line so long you could smell the brine from the corner of Delancey. That was the Lower East Side in the 1950s, a neighborhood where Yiddish was still the first language in most kitchens, and every tenement hallway carried the smell of onions, browning, and chicken fat. The drink at number 14 had no egg and no cream in it, and half of New York argued about that for decades. Number 23 sat in the back of the refrigerator in a bowl that nobody in the family wanted to open. And the bread at number 1 told you whether the week had been good or bad before anyone said a word. These recipes crossed the Atlantic from shtetls in Poland, Lithuania, Romania, and Ukraine, and landed in railroad flats where the stove ran 6 days a week and rested on Shabbos. Hit subscribe, because here are 25 foods Jewish families ate on the 1950s Lower East Side. Number 25. Kishki. Beef intestine casing stuffed with a mixture of flour, onions, and rendered chicken fat, seasoned with salt, pepper, and paprika, then roasted until the outside turned brown, and the filling inside firmed into something that tasted like a savory bread pudding made entirely of fat and onion. Butchers on Essex Street sold the casings, and the women who made kishki at home cleaned and scraped them at the sink before stuffing them by hand. Most families served it sliced alongside cholent on Saturday afternoon, the rounds glistening with the fat that had rendered out during the long roast. The flavor was not subtle. It was salt, onion, and animal fat in a dense package that sat heavy in the stomach and kept a person full through a long winter afternoon when the heat in the building came and went on its own schedule. Number 24. Shav. Cold sorrel soup made from fresh sorrel leaves, simmered in water with a little salt and sugar, cooled, and served with a spoonful of sour cream stirred into the bowl. The soup was thin and bright green, tart enough to make the mouth pucker, and cold enough in the summer to feel like relief after a walk up 5 flights of stairs in a building with no air conditioning. Families bought bundles of sorrel at the pushcart markets along Hester Street when the leaves showed up in late spring. The season was short. By midsummer, the leaves turned bitter, and shav disappeared from the table until the following year. Children who disliked it got no sympathy. The sour cream was the concession. Number 23. Pacha. Calves' feet simmered for hours until the collagen dissolved into the broth, then poured into a dish with sliced hard-boiled eggs and whole cloves of garlic, and left in the refrigerator overnight until the liquid set into a firm, trembling jelly. The surface glistened. The garlic cloves sat visible in the clear gelatin like objects trapped in amber. Picha was the food that separated the devoted from the merely tolerant. Grandmothers served it cold, sliced into squares, with a piece of rye bread on the side. The taste was mild, mostly garlic and salt, but the texture was the issue. Cold meat jelly was not something a child reached for voluntarily. The bowl sat in the back of the refrigerator until someone either ate it or quietly disposed of it when the woman who made it was not watching. Number 22. Schmaltz. Rendered chicken fat made by slowly cooking the fat and skin trimmed from a chicken in a heavy pan with sliced onions until the fat melted clear and the solids turned into golden crispy bits called gribeens. The liquid fat was strained into a jar and kept in the refrigerator, where it solidified into a pale yellow spread that went on bread, into mashed potatoes, and into almost everything else that needed richness. Schmaltz was the cooking fat of the entire kitchen. Butter could not be used with meat under the dietary laws, and olive oil was expensive and unfamiliar. Chicken fat was free or close to it because every chicken that came through the kitchen left behind enough trimmings to render a small jar. The gribeens were eaten as a snack, salted, sometimes still warm from the pan. Number 21. Mandelbrot. Almond bread, sliced and baked twice until each piece turned dry, crisp, and hard enough to survive a week in a tin on the counter without going stale. The dough was simple, made from eggs, sugar, oil, flour, and a handful of almonds or sometimes walnuts, shaped into a log, baked once, then sliced on an angle and baked again until the edges browned. Mandelbrot sat next to the tea glass in every apartment on the Lower East Side. It was the cookie that was not quite a cookie, harder than a biscuit, less sweet than a cake, made to be dunked in hot tea until the edge softened just enough to bite. A woman who kept a full tin of Mandelbrot on the counter was a woman whose kitchen was in order. Number 20. Flanken. Beef short ribs, cut across the bone into flat strips, simmered in a pot of water with onions, carrots, celery, and sometimes a marrow bone for hours until the meat went soft enough to fall apart when pressed with the back of a spoon. The broth turned cloudy and rich, and a layer of golden fat floated on the surface that some families skimmed and others stirred back in. Flanken was Friday food. It appeared on the table before sundown as part of the Shabbos meal, served in a shallow bowl with the broth ladled over it, alongside boiled potatoes and a piece of challah for soaking up the liquid. The meat was not seared, not browned, not seasoned with anything sharper than salt, pepper, and a bay leaf. The flavor came from time. 4 hours in the pot turned a tough, cheap cut of beef into something that dissolved on the tongue and left behind a richness that no quick-cooked steak could match. Butchers in the neighborhood cut flanken to order, sawing through the rib bones with a bandsaw and wrapping the strips in brown paper. A woman who asked for flanken on Thursday afternoon was telling the butcher she was preparing for Shabbos, and he knew without being told to trim the fat but leave enough on the bone to flavor the broth. The transaction required no conversation. The cut, the day, and the customer told the whole story. The broth left over from the flanken was never thrown out. It went into a jar in the refrigerator and became the base for soup later in the week, or it was reheated and served on its own with a piece of bread when someone came home cold. A pot of flanken produced 2 meals at least, and sometimes 3, without anyone having to buy another piece of meat. Number 19. Zeies. A slow-cooked dish of carrots, sweet potatoes, and dried prunes, simmered with honey and a little cinnamon until everything broke down into a thick, sweet mass that straddled the line between a side dish and a dessert. Some families added a piece of brisket to the pot and turned it into a main course. Others kept it vegetable only and served it in a small bowl alongside the roast. Zeies showed up at Rosh Hashanah and stayed through the fall. The sweetness was the point. Honey and carrots together carried a symbolic weight in the Jewish New Year meal, a wish for sweetness in the coming year, and every family on the Lower East Side had a version that they considered definitive. Number 18. Crepllock. Small pockets of egg noodle dough filled with seasoned ground beef or chicken, pinched shut into triangles and dropped into hot chicken soup. They sank to the bottom, then floated when done, and a bowl of soup with 3 or 4 Crepllock in it was a meal that needed nothing else beside it. The dough was rolled thin on a floured table, cut into squares, and filled one at a time. Making Crepllock was slow work, and most families reserved it for holidays or special Shabbos meals when the effort felt justified. The filling was usually leftover roast meat ground fine with sautéed onion, and the dough sealed around it in a way that held together during the boil without splitting open and spilling the meat into the broth. Number 17. Kasha varnishkis. Roasted buckwheat groats mixed with bow tie pasta and onions that had been cooked slowly in chicken fat until they turned dark brown and sweet. The kasha had a nutty, earthy flavor that tasted like nothing else in the kitchen, and the pasta softened it into something that worked as both a side dish and a meal on its own. The trick was toasting the kasha in a dry pan with a beaten egg before adding water, which kept each grain separate instead of turning the whole pot into mush. Families served it alongside brisket or roast chicken, and the bowl went around the table until it was empty. The dish required no expensive ingredients. Buckwheat was cheap, pasta was cheap, onions were cheap, and the chicken fat was already sitting in a jar in the refrigerator. Number 16. Chopped liver. Chicken livers sautéed with onions in Schmaltz, then chopped fine on a wooden board with a curved blade called a hackmesser until the texture was rough but spreadable. A hard-boiled egg went into the mix, chopped along with everything else, and the whole thing was mounded onto a plate and served with crackers or rye bread. Chopped liver appeared at every holiday table and most Friday night dinners on the Lower East Side. The flavor was rich, metallic, and deeply savory, and a person either craved it or pushed the plate away. The onions were the key. Cooked long enough in the fat, they turned sweet and took the edge off the iron taste of the liver, and the egg lightened the whole thing just enough that it spread across a piece of bread without feeling heavy. Number 15, Borcht. Beet soup, served hot in the winter with a boiled potato dropped into the bowl, or cold in the summer with a spoonful of sour cream floating on the surface. The beets turned the broth a shade of purple so deep it stained the pot, the ladle, and the tablecloth if anyone spilled. Cold borscht in August was one of the defining tastes of a Lower East Side summer. The soup came out of the refrigerator in a glass jar, poured into a bowl, and the sour cream went in last, swirling into the purple in a pattern that dissolved before the first spoonful reached the mouth. Some families made it from scratch, grating the beets and simmering them with lemon juice and sugar. Others bought it in jars from the dairy restaurants on East Houston Street, where borscht was as standard as water on every table. Number 14, egg cream. A fountain drink made from chocolate syrup, cold whole milk, and a hard blast of seltzer from a pressurized tap, stirred fast enough that the top foamed white and the chocolate swirled through the middle in dark ribbons. There was no egg in it. There was no cream. The name made no sense, and nobody on the Lower East Side wasted a minute trying to explain it. Candy stores and soda fountains on every other block served egg creams from the counter, and the technique mattered as much as the ingredients. The syrup went in first, the milk second, the seltzer last, aimed at the spoon so the pressure whipped the surface into foam. A good egg cream had a white head that lasted until the glass was half empty. A bad one went flat before the first sip. Children drank them after school, standing at the counter with a nickel on the marble. Adults drank them with a sandwich at lunch. The egg cream was not a treat reserved for special occasions. It was a daily thing, as routine as the newspaper and the walk to work, and a candy store that made a good one never lacked for customers. The seltzer had to come from a pressurized tap, not a bottle. Bottled seltzer lacked the force to whip the foam properly, and a flat egg cream was a failure that no amount of syrup could rescue. The candy store owner who pulled the tap handle knew exactly how long to hold it, and the spray hit the spoon at an angle that sent the milk and syrup spiraling into each other while the foam rose on top. The debate over which candy store made the best egg cream on the Lower East Side lasted longer than most arguments about politics or religion and was taken more seriously by the people involved. The Lower East Side in the 1950s was a neighborhood measured in blocks, not miles. From the Bowery to the East River, from Houston Street to the Manhattan Bridge, families packed into tenement buildings that had been standing since before the turn of the century. The kitchens were narrow, the stoves were old, and the food that came out of them fed a generation that would carry the taste of it into every suburb and city they moved to for the rest of their lives. Number 13. Herring. Pickled, creamed, or smoked, herring showed up in glass jars, wrapped in newspaper, or sliced to order from a whole fish at the appetizing store on Houston Street. Pickled herring came in a brine sour enough to sting the tongue. Creamed herring sat in a thick white sauce with sliced onions. Schmaltz herring was cured in salt and oil and eaten in pieces with black bread. Sunday morning on the Lower East Side started with herring on the table. A man walked to the appetizing store before the rest of the family woke up, came back with a quarter-pound wrapped in paper, and set it out next to the bread, the cream cheese, and the sliced tomato. The smell filled the apartment. Guests either understood or they did not. Number 12. Blintzes. Thin crepes filled with sweetened farmer cheese, folded into rectangles, and fried in butter until the outside turned golden and crisp, and the cheese inside went soft and warm. Blueberries or cherry preserves went on top, and a spoonful of sour cream finished the plate. Blintzes were Shavuot food, tied to the holiday when dairy meals took precedence, but families on the Lower East Side made them year-round because a dozen eggs and a block of farmer cheese from the dairy on Essex Street cost next to nothing and fed a full table. The crepes were cooked on one side only, then flipped onto a towel, filled and folded. The second cooking happened in the pan with butter, and the smell of browning butter and warm cheese was strong enough to reach the hallway. Number 11. Gefilte fish. Ground whitefish and pike mixed with egg, matzo meal, onion, and a pinch of sugar, shaped into ovals, and poached in a broth made from the fish bones and heads until the dumplings were cooked through and the broth had reduced into a jelly that coated them when chilled. A slice of cooked carrot sat on top of each piece, and the whole platter went to the table with a jar of red horseradish that burned the sinuses on contact. Gefilte fish was Passover and Shabbos, the dish that announced a formal meal before anything else appeared. The grinding was the hardest part. Before electric grinders, the fish was chopped by hand on a wooden board, and the sound of the blade hitting the board was the rhythm of a Friday morning in every tenement kitchen on the block. Number 10. Latkes. Potatoes grated raw on a box grater, squeezed dry in a towel, mixed with egg and a spoonful of matzo meal, and fried in hot oil until the edges turned dark brown and crisp and the center stayed soft and steaming. The oil splattered across the stove, the counter, and the apron of the woman standing over the pan, and the smell of frying potato hung in the apartment for the rest of the day. Latkes belonged to Hanukkah, but on the Lower East Side they showed up whenever potatoes were cheap and the meal needed stretching. A pile of latkes, a bowl of applesauce, and a spoonful of sour cream was dinner for a family that had nothing else in the kitchen and needed nothing else. The dairy restaurants, the appetizing stores, the bakeries with the hand-lettered signs in Yiddish and English. By the end of the 1960s, most of them were gone, replaced or shuttered as families moved to Brooklyn, to Queens, to the suburbs of Long Island and New Jersey. The food traveled with them, but the context did not. A niche eaten in a split level in Great Neck was the same recipe and a completely different experience. Number 9. Noodle Kugel. Egg noodles baked in a casserole with eggs, sour cream, cottage cheese, sugar, vanilla, and a handful of raisins, topped with a crust of cornflake crumbs mixed with melted butter and cinnamon. The top browned in the oven and turned crunchy. The inside stayed soft and custardy, and the raisins plumped in the heat until they burst with sweetness when bitten. Kugel was the dish that appeared at every gathering without anyone having to be asked to bring it. A woman showed up at a holiday dinner with a kugel in a foil-covered pan, and the pan went home empty. Families argued about raisins the way other families argued about politics. Some insisted they belonged. Others picked them out and left a small pile on the side of the plate. The casserole fed a crowd for almost nothing. A box of egg noodles, a few eggs, a pint of sour cream, and whatever cottage cheese was on sale at the dairy. The whole thing went into a rectangular baking dish and sat in the oven for an hour while the apartment filled with a smell that was equal parts butter, cinnamon, and warm noodle. Some families made a savory version with no sugar, no raisins, and no cinnamon, using only salt, pepper, and fried onions mixed through the noodles before baking. The savory kugel went with brisket. The sweet one went with everything else. A household that made both was a household that took Shabbos seriously, and the oven worked twice on Friday afternoon to get both pans done before sundown. The leftovers were better cold the next morning, eaten standing at the counter with a fork, and a pan of kugel that came back from a gathering untouched was a failure that followed the cook for months. Number 8. Matzo ball soup. Chicken broth, clear and golden, with 2 or 3 matzo balls floating in the bowl. The matzo balls were made from matzo meal, eggs, and chicken fat, mixed together and rolled into spheres that expanded during cooking into soft, pillowy dumplings that soaked up the broth and fell apart at the touch of a spoon. The density of the matzo ball was the defining question. Some families made them light and airy, almost dissolving on the tongue. Others made them heavy and dense, the kind that sat in the stomach like a stone and kept a person full through a long afternoon. Both camps were certain they were right. The broth beneath was always the same. A whole chicken, simmered for hours with carrots, celery, dill, and onion, strained until the liquid ran clear and tasted like the distilled essence of everything that had gone into the pot. Number 7. Rugelach. Cream cheese dough rolled thin, spread with cinnamon sugar, chopped walnuts and raisins, then rolled into small crescent shapes and baked until the pastry turned flaky and the filling caramelized at the edges. Some bakeries used jam instead of cinnamon, and a few added a ribbon of chocolate, but the classic Lower East Side version was always cinnamon and walnut. Rugelach came from the bakery in a white box tied with string, and the box rarely made it home intact. Someone on the walk back opened the corner, pulled one out, and ate it on the street. A full box held 2 or 3 dozen, and the pieces were small enough that eating 4 felt reasonable, and eating 6 felt only slightly excessive. Number 6. Knishes. A shell of dough wrapped around a filling of mashed potato and onion, baked or fried until the outside turned golden and the potato inside stayed hot and dense. The classic Lower East Side niche was round, flat on top, and large enough to fill a hand. Pushcart vendors sold them on Orchard Street, on Delancey, and on the corner of Houston, wrapped in wax paper, eaten standing up. The potato filling was the standard, but Knishes also came stuffed with Kasha, with sauerkraut, or with ground beef. The potato version dominated because it was the cheapest and the most universally liked, and a single niche with a bottle of seltzer was a lunch that cost almost nothing and left a person full enough to work through the afternoon without thinking about food again. Yonah Schimmel's Nishery on Houston Street had been operating since 1910, and by the 1950s it was an institution. The niches there were baked, not fried, and the dough was thinner than the street vendor version, which let the potato filling do most of the work. Regulars ordered by holding up fingers. 1 niche, 2 niches. The man behind the counter did not need to hear the word. The Kasha knish had a stronger flavor, earthier, with the buckwheat pushing back against the dough in a way that the potato version never did. A person who ordered Kasha instead of potato was making a statement about what they grew up eating, and the vendor knew to wrap it without asking twice. A niche that came off a pushcart in January, still hot inside the wax paper, warmed both hands before it warmed the stomach. On a cold day on Orchard Street, that mattered as much as the taste. Number 5. Pickles. Sour pickles and half-sour pickles, pulled from wooden barrels that sat on the sidewalk in front of shops along Essex Street and Orchard Street. The sour ones had fermented long enough to turn olive green and tangy all the way through. The half-sours were still bright green, still crunchy, with a clean salt flavor that had not yet crossed into full fermentation. A customer pointed at the barrel, the vendor reached in with a long fork, and the pickle came out dripping brine. Children ate them on the street, holding the pickle in one hand and catching the drips with the other. The brine smell hung in the air around those shops and mixed with the smell of smoked fish from next door in a combination that defined what the Lower East Side smelled like on a Saturday morning. Number 4. Brisket. A flat cut of beef, rubbed with garlic, onion, salt, and pepper, seared in a hot pan, then braised low and slow in a covered roasting pan with onions, carrots, and a splash of water or broth until the meat turned tender enough to slice against the grain with a bread knife. The braising took 3 to 4 hours, and the apartment smelled like roasting beef and caramelized onion for the rest of the day. Brisket was Friday night dinner and every major holiday. It fed a crowd because a single cut served 8 or 10 people, and the leftovers sliced cold the next day for sandwiches tasted better than the original meal. The gravy at the bottom of the pan, thick with dissolved onion and beef drippings, went over everything on the plate. A woman who could turn out a tender brisket with a good gravy had a reputation on the block that no other dish could build. Number 3. Pastrami on rye. Beef navel cured in salt, sugar, garlic, and black pepper, smoked low for hours, then steamed until the meat went tender enough to slice thin and stack high between 2 slices of rye bread with a smear of spicy brown mustard. The sandwich arrived at the table overstuffed, leaning slightly to one side, with the pastrami piled thick enough that the bread could barely contain it. Delicatessens on the Lower East Side built their reputations on the quality of their pastrami. The smoke, the spice, the tenderness, and the ratio of lean to fat all mattered, and a regular customer could tell within one bite whether the batch was up to standard. A pastrami sandwich and a pickle from the barrel on the counter was lunch for anyone who could afford it, and for some who stretched the budget to make it happen once a week regardless. Number 2. Bagels with lox and cream cheese. a dense, chewy ring of boiled and baked bread, sliced open and spread thick with cream cheese, layered with thin slices of cured salmon, and topped with a slice of raw onion, a tomato round, and sometimes a few capers. The bagel had to be fresh. The lox had to be sliced thin enough to drape over the cream cheese without tearing, and the cream cheese had to be spread thick enough that it held everything in place. Sunday morning was bagel morning. A man walked to the bakery before anyone else in the apartment was awake, came home with a bag still warm from the oven, and the rest of the morning unfolded around that bag. The lox came from the appetizing store, sliced to order, wrapped in waxed paper. The combination of salt from the fish, richness from the cream cheese, sharpness from the onion, and the dense chew of a fresh bagel was a meal that needed no improvement and tolerated none. Number 1. Challah. Braided egg bread, baked golden on top and soft inside, with a sweetness that came from the eggs and the pinch of sugar in the dough. The crust was thin and glossy from an egg wash, and the inside pulled apart in long, tender strands. Challah appeared every Friday afternoon, still warm from the bakery or from the oven, covered with a cloth on the table next to the candles. Challah was not just bread. It was the line between the week and Shabbos. When the challah was on the table and the candles were lit, the week was over. Whatever had happened in the shop, at the factory, in the school, on the street, stopped at the edge of that tablecloth. A woman who baked her own challah on Friday morning filled the entire floor of the tenement with a smell that told every family in the building the same thing. The week is done. Come sit down. The bakeries on East Houston have new names now, and most of the push carts are photographs in someone's album. But every dish on this list still shows up somewhere, in a kitchen in Brooklyn, in a dining room in Teaneck, on a holiday table in Boca Raton, made by someone who learned it from someone who learned it in a tenement on the Lower East Side. If any of these were on your family's table, leave a comment and tell me which one. And if you have not already, hit subscribe.